justice statement. And to kick us off, I wanted to just welcome everyone to the space. This is our 4th time meeting as the Environmental Equity and Cumulative Impacts Subcommittee. So, you know, we've met quite a few times so far, and this is the last meeting that we'll have prior to our full task force meeting taking place on June 21st. At that June 21st meeting, we'll be looking at an official first draft of the recommendations. And so, as you can see from the agenda, we will be dedicating the first about 40 minutes or so of this meeting to hearing from some colleagues at the Chicago Department of Public Health on a health impacts assessment that they conducted. And once we hear from them and kind of learn a little bit about their experience, we'll then dive back into reviewing some of the draft recommendations that you all are familiar with. I do want to make note that at our last meeting, we did talk a lot about those recommendations and recurring questions. And since then, we have incorporated that feedback from the last meeting in April into the recommendations that we'll be looking at during this meeting. Renee, I wanted to maybe turn it over to you to see if, before we go any further, if you would like to ground us in a land acknowledgement.
Sure. Forgive me if I have my camera off. I'm recovering from a really bad flu this past weekend, so I'm barely feeling good today. But Tlazohcamati umeto, Tlazohcamati atatonatiu, Tlazohcamati tonan simplali, Tlazohcamati abuelitos y abuelitas, and all the ones that came before. We live on the land of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Lakota, the Shoshone, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Navajo, the Apache, the Chicano, and 48 tribes that still live and travel through these spaces. I ask that we always recognize this because all of these tribes have been erased. No treaty has ever been honored. And if we are truly going to move with equity analysis going forward, we need to move with cultural and trauma sensitivity in these contexts in every form. So I thank you all for being good ancestors in this space, and I hope that we truly move for future generations. Ometo.
Thank you, Renee. And I will go ahead and paste our running subcommittee members into the chat. And Beatriz or Renee, would you like to go ahead and take roll call? And you can use the names in the chat as reference as we go through. And we'll just make note of who is here and who is not.
Yeah, if Renee is feeling a little down, I'm happy to take roll call. Arthur Ortegon.
Here.
Doug Dean.
I'm here.
Ian Tafoya.
Present.
Elizabeth Scoder. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, it doesn't look like Elizabeth's here. Thanks.
Gray Arnold.
It's Gary, but present.
Gary, sorry. Ilda Nucete.
Presente.
Jaime Valdez.
Presente.
Jordan Breesley. Kimberly Mendoza Cook.
Yeah, and Kimberly will be joining in just a few minutes.
Marcia Nelson.
Here.
Mira Flickling.
Present.
Renee Millard Chacon.
Presente.
Trisha Oeth.
I'm here.
Tyson Johnson. And I think that's all of us.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Looks like the majority of us are here. So thanks for that. And we will reach out to the folks that aren't here and see if they might just be a few minutes behind. Okay, so with that said, as you all can see in the agenda that I had posted in the chat, Well, actually, I'll take a moment to pause and see if Beatriz and Renee, if you had any, did you all want to do kind of a conversation opener, an icebreaker before we got started? And no worries if not, you want to jump right in.
I think we should jump right in. I always feel like we're lacking time at the end.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so one thing I just wanted to make note of was to give folks a refresher on what we discussed at the last meeting. Joel, if you actually could just copy paste that summary directly into the chat, it's hyperlinked in the agenda as well. But I wanted to provide people a refresher of what we discussed last time. As I mentioned, we met on April 27th, and we talked about the recommendations and reoccurring questions that we had laid out at the full task force meeting earlier in April. A couple of topics that Joel had presented on were related to Title V and Title VI. As a quick refresher, we reviewed and discussed the EPA Suncor Plant 2 Title V objection letter. For clarity, the Title V refers to the Federal Clean Air Act, which covers air quality permits. In addition to one formal objection related to a technical aspect of the air permit, EPA also made several recommendations about ways that CDPHE can expand our work to advance environmental justice. The EPA objection letter regarding the Title V permit for the Suncor plant included lots of recommendations, including the recommendation for an analysis on cumulative air impacts. And for CDPHE's air division, from CDPHE's air division perspective, it appears that there's two ways to perform and look at cumulative impacts, kind of looking at the source of pollution, as well as the media or type of pollutants. The other thing that we talked about were Title V, disparate impact analyses. Title VI. Title VI refers to the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And one way to ensure discrimination does not occur is to conduct a disparate impact analysis for certain agency actions. And so we kind of talked a little bit more about how a disparate impact might occur when policies, practices, rules, or other systems that are facially neutral unintentionally result in a disproportionate impact on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And we briefly talked about, not in a whole lot of detail, but we had some questions floating around about, is a disparate impact analysis the same or different than an equity analysis? Whether a Title VI compliance and disparate impact analysis fit within the task force equity analysis recommendations. And so, for example, should we recommend that an equity analysis also fulfill the minimum requirement for Title VI disparate impact analysis? And then lastly, we talked about what does trauma and cultural sensitivity look like in this space. I just wanted to bring those up because while we might not be talking about Title V or Title VI, and if those titles are confusing to you, please do refer to the meeting summary, which just bullet point outlines kind of what those two things are, especially for our members of the public. I know that sometimes that terminology can be a little confusing, but we just want to keep these two things in mind as we continue to formulate our recommendations for this subcommittee. And lastly, as I mentioned, we did review the recommendations and reoccurring questions. The recommendations and reoccurring questions that are hyperlinked in the meeting summary are kind of the very first version that we were looking at last month. There is an updated version that we will be looking at for the purposes of this meeting. That updated kind of version is hyperlinked in the meeting agenda. All right, with that said, I do want to go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'll briefly introduce Megan and Kate, and if you all could, provide a little bit more background about yourselves and feel free to continue introducing yourselves to the group. We have invited Megan and Kate from the Chicago Department of Public Health to provide a presentation on a health impacts assessment that the Department of Public Health in Chicago conducted. And I actually won't go much further than that. I'll go ahead and let Megan and Kate introduce the topic and themselves. Megan and Kate, if you could present for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the group to ask questions and have a discussion. And again, for our subcommittee members, really this is an excellent case study for us to learn from, and a really great opportunity for us to ask questions from folks that have gone through this process. You know, when we're talking about a health impact assessment, this is very much related to an equity analysis or a cumulative impacts assessment that we are developing recommendations around. So again, perfect case study. Happy to learn from them and looking forward to this group being active and in asking questions with these subject matter experts. So I will, Megan and Kate, let you all take it away. Feel free to share your own slides with your own screen, but if you would like us to advance your slides, we're happy to do that as well.
Sure. Thanks for that kind introduction, Lubna, and thanks to you and Joel for inviting us to be with the task force today. As we were sharing with Lubna and Joel, as we were first learning about you all, we are deeply and truly impressed by the process that you're embarked on collectively to really think in a systematic way about what cumulative impact assessment should look like for the state of Colorado, how you're determining when and in what ways it's applied. The case study we're going to share with you today did not have the benefit of all of this good and rich kind of foreplanning. It was a bit opportunistic on the part of the Chicago Department of Public Health to really take an opportunity of a highly controversial permit decision here in the city of Chicago to step back and apply some of our health and cumulative impact assessment tools in an effort to make a more fully informed decision. And now on the back end, having gone through this process, we are kind of beginning now where you all are in launching this much more collaborative and longer term and systematic approach to thinking about embedding and institutionalizing the use of health impact assessment as part of our approach to the future. So I offer all of that as a little bit of a disclaimer that what you are about to see is just a case study. We were learning by doing this. We don't hold this up as the perfect example, but we do think that it is incredibly important to engage in conversations like these, to share what we learned along the way, why we did what we did, reflect on what we might have done differently with a different set of resources or a different timeline. And so please do engage with us in a spirit of just shared learning. And we are very happy to answer all the questions we can. So with that, my name is Megan Cunningham. I'm the Managing Deputy Commissioner for the Chicago Department of Public Health. I lead our Bureau of Community Health, which is focused on really thinking about the conditions of place and how we address the root causes of health to really promote more equitable health and racial outcomes in the city of Chicago. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Kate McMahon. Kate, did you want to introduce briefly as well?
Sure. Good afternoon, all. My name is Kate McMahon. My pronouns are she, her. I direct the Health Equity and All Policies team at the Chicago Department of Public Health. And we're the team in our health department that works across policy areas and sectors to embed equity in decision making. So we think about health equity as a process in addition to an outcome.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And Lubna, keep me honest on the time as we're getting close to our 15 minutes. Just give me the high sign. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yep.
Great. So this is our agenda for our brief presentation today. We'll start with some background on the RMG Southside Recycling permit, so you have some context in which this HIA was conducted. And then we'll talk about the health impact assessment process itself. We'll spend some time on the values that we brought into this process, how we conducted the screening and scoping step, as well as our assessment, and then ultimately how all of this work of the health impact assessment contributed to our decision making. And then as time permits, we'll also just reflect on a few of our lessons learned through this process. So just to begin with background, RMG stands for Reserve Management Group. It is an Ohio-based metal recycling company. And importantly, RMG purchased General Iron, which was another recycling facility that was operating in Lincoln Park in the city of Chicago. Lincoln Park is a predominantly white, affluent community. The location for the proposed RMG Southside recycling facility is on the southeast side of Chicago, which is a lower income, predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhood area. So there were, from the very outset, real concerns related to environmental justice with the siting of this particular project. However, this site was in a district that had been zoned for industry for many years, and the company itself had operated recycling facilities in the area for more than 3 decades. And their proposal now is to really expand their site to accept scrap metal, including end-of-life vehicles, for processing and recycling. The permitting was well underway prior to us determining that we were going to pause and conduct a health impact assessment. And this timeline matters, and I think is instructive for a number of reasons as we think about the process of conducting a health impact assessment and the way in which we go through each of the successive steps. So just as quick background, the project received approval from our zoning board in 2019. And the Chicago Department of Buildings approved various permits along with Illinois EPA construction and operating permits in early 2020. So the company began at that point to actually install these new equipment. And CDPH, in anticipation of a permit application coming before us, actually proactively and affirmatively adopted new rules for large recycling facilities operating in the city that were intended to really address some of the most common community quality of life concerns. So things related to air quality and noise and truck traffic and stormwater pollution prevention and treatment plans. All of that was contained within this set of new large recycling facility rules that we adopted in mid-2020. And we began engaging the community even at that time in advance of an operating permit coming before our department through a series of community town halls, which were large and well attended. This was, as I mentioned before, a facility that had received significant community input. Large scale demonstrations were being held. In fact, at one point, there was a hunger strike in opposition to the relocation of these assets to the southeast side of Chicago. So it became truly a flashpoint within the city for grappling with how we can both, on the one hand, really espouse commitment to equity and to environmental justice, while on the other hand, allowing a permit of this sort to move forward. So in early 2021, CDPH actually initiated our review of this permit through a health impact assessment. We did so on the recommendation of the United States EPA, which intervened on behalf of some of these community members who had been sounding the alarm about the community implications of this relocation. And we listened to the community and we listened to the US EPA. And we said that although this is not a common part of our permitting process, we did find that it was necessary and appropriate in the conditions of this particular permit in order to allow us an opportunity to really step back and examine in their fullness all of the potential health and environmental and quality of life effects that this proposed facility could have on a neighborhood that was, even by our own public health accounting, highly vulnerable to negative effects from pollution exposure. And then in 2022, after going through a period of significant public engagement, a series of sessions to help us develop and to carry out the health impact assessment, we actually did use these findings to ultimately deny RMG their operating permit. And we did so in tandem with publicly releasing our HIA report and summarizing its findings in a transparent way. This was the first time that CDPH had predicated a permit denial on the sort of cumulative impacts of pollution on a neighborhood and really taking underlying health and social factors into account. So a little bit about our process and our values. Healthy Chicago 2025 is our citywide community health improvement plan. As a local public health department, we are required every few years to conduct large-scale assessments of health and well-being across the city. We do this in collaboration with hundreds of community stakeholder organizations and residents across the city of Chicago, partners across city government and other sectors. And our most recent plan, Healthy Chicago 2025, is centered on closing Chicago's racial life expectancy gap. Our data show that even before COVID, a Black Chicagoan lived on average 9 years less long than a white Chicagoan. That gap has increased over the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic. And we know that in order to close that life expectancy gap, to achieve this vision for the city of Chicago, we must focus on the root causes of health, and we must be explicit about institutional racism itself as a cause of the life expectancy gap that we see here in the city. And we must affirmatively redress those harms through some of the policy and process change work that we'll describe a bit today. We also recognize through our Healthy Chicago 2025 plan the necessity of supporting communities in their power to allow them to weigh in on the types of permits that affect their neighborhood and the conditions of their local environment. So we brought equity and environmental justice to the forefront of our process as guiding values. And as Kate said, even just in her introduction, we think about equity both as an outcome and a process. And to operationalize it, we thought it was important to follow all of these elements on the right. So first, to be really explicit about how we define the problem, in this case, the proposed relocation of these assets from the north side of Chicago to the southeast side of the city. We have to acknowledge the history of land use and zoning decisions that have made it so industry proliferates in some areas of our city and not in others. We had to compare conditions on the southeast side to non-environmental justice community areas across the city. And critically, we had to look not just at what folks often think of as the data, the numbers, the scientific and the technical information that go into permit review, but also to really look at narratives and to value communities' lived experience as a co-equal input into this permitting process. And we had to attempt to the extent possible to shift power through authentic engagement with community members. Now, in this case, there were many constraints that were placed upon this process. There were constraints in terms of timeline. This process was being litigated as well. And so the city was being sued both by the company as well as by the community. There were some mandates from these processes that required us to move quickly, to be more constrained in what we could say publicly and how we could represent our process publicly. So we were really working within those constraints to try to determine how far could we go towards the fullest expression of that value of real, authentic, and meaningful engagement. And recognizing that we were starting from a place of pretty profound community mistrust because of the history and practice of our department and of the city of Chicago overall in permitting decisions in the past that had not reflected these values. We were also intentional about needing to measure both the benefits and burdens specifically to the people who live on the southeast side of Chicago and not just looking at benefits potentially to the city overall. And trying to embrace transparency and accountability, making all of our information accessible in English and in Spanish, putting it on our website, being public about what we were doing, when, and why. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we knew that if we were going to embark on a health impact assessment, we had to be committed to acting on the basis of its findings. So turning now to just a bit about our screening and scoping. CDPH looked to the minimum elements and practice standards for health impact assessment as sort of our guidepost for all of this work. And we wanted to be rigorous about going through each of the steps as outlined there. Here's just a brief overview of some of the factors that we considered in ultimately determining that it was necessary and appropriate to conduct a health impact assessment for this particular permit. One was that we did really see this as an opportunity to explicitly consider environmental justice and health equity in review of the permit decision. We also saw this as an important opportunity to review data, not limited to just what we typically consider in a permit review around environmental impacts, but to think more expansively about other quality of life, social, and health impacts. We also were cognizant of the fact that we had the support of the US EPA to embark on this process, and they were offering expertise, as well as some data to assist us in our review. And we knew that we had the necessary authority to actually commit to action, that we could, and we did hold within our department the ability to make a decision about whether or not to grant the permit, or to grant the permit with special conditions that were meant to mitigate the concerns raised through the process. And then significantly, we were very focused throughout, because this was our first health impact assessment of a proposed industrial development in the city of Chicago. We knew that we weren't doing this HIA just to answer a discrete question about a single permit. What we were really trying to do here was build the foundation for the sorts of cumulative impact assessment work that you all are talking about in Colorado. We wanted to challenge the city and work with our community stakeholders to think broadly about policy and process changes that were really lifted up as being, gaps as they exist in the city today, and things that we needed to work affirmatively towards addressing if we wanted to ensure that our permitting processes reflected equity and environmental justice values. So a bit then about our scoping process. As I mentioned, we were sort of retrofitting a health impact assessment on a permitting review process that had been underway for a couple of years at the point at which we decided to initiate an HIA. So much of our input that allowed us to do scoping was really from these initial town halls and significant public comment periods that we had held even before the HIA kicked off. So we used all of that input to create a conceptual framework and research questions in a pathway diagram. And then once we launched the HIA, we used these touch points with our community partners and organizations to really prioritize the impacts, to pressure test and make sure that what we heard before the HIA still reflected the most salient benefits and burdens and the lived experience of community members. So that was what we were really doing during the HIA process itself, to refine and to further help us scope the assessment. So I'll share with you just quickly, these are the research questions that we landed upon. They reflect the conceptual framework that we adopted, which was really to acknowledge that the city's land use and zoning policies and our environmental permitting and regulations are the drivers of community conditions as we experience them in our neighborhoods, both the neighborhood environment itself in terms of pollution exposure, as well as the social conditions of our communities, like economic opportunity and access to care, and that drives people's health outcomes. And we think about health in its totality as being physical as well as mental health and an overall sense of well-being. And then we drew our research questions from, in some cases, traditional environmental impact assessment, but we layered on what we saw as the key elements of environmental justice analysis, cumulative impact analysis, racial equity impact assessment, in order to create research questions that we thought got at the heart of the issues that were presented by this permit. So we knew we needed to examine what are the community conditions on the southeast side today, as they exist today before any permit might issue. And then we needed to look at the potential impacts on the environment, on health and quality of life for Southeast Side residents. We needed to consider who would benefit and who would be burdened, and how we could minimize or mitigate the burdens and maximize the benefits. And then finally, as I mentioned, we were very focused on what could we do and learn from this process in order to improve other city policies and practices. This is our pathway diagram. As you'll see, this is a bit of a spaghetti diagram. I don't expect you to make sense of all of this here. I only share it to show you how complex and how interrelated all of these impacts are across health, equity, and the environment. So you'll see we have things here reflected around climate resilience, around mental health of residents, around community voice and power. So we really did attempt to kind of map all of this into a pathway diagram. But ultimately what this led us towards was, I'll skip ahead. There's a note here about geographic scope as well for anyone who's interested. We used our pathway diagram to think about who would most directly experience the benefits and burdens of the proposed facility. And ultimately we settled on 3 communities based on those with the greatest potential to be directly affected by pollution exposure, those that would experience the operational impacts such as truck traffic, noise, and odors, And because we were really truly about building community power and choice and decision-making, we were focused on communities that had expressed the greatest concern about Southside recycling. So then shifting to our assessment, as you saw from our pathways diagram, because these were such a complex and interrelated set of impacts that we were attempting to examine, we knew that there was no one tool or one type of assessment that was going to get at the wholeness of those impacts. And so we understood very early on that we would need to take a mixed methods approach to our assessment. And that drew upon all of the information that came from the permit application itself, including some of the modeling that the company had produced, its own mitigation plans, its traffic study and zoning materials. I'm trying to be intentional about reading all these things because I think that was important for the translators, but Libna, tell me if I should do less of that in the interest of time.
I think it's fine. Yeah. Yeah, I think the main thing is just with pace. So when you're reading, I think it's fine so far.
Okay.
If we get a thumbs up from our interpreters. But yes, I think everything.
We're okay. Okay, just checking. And then because we really did want to include community voice as part of the data that we considered in this assessment, we not only looked to, as I described, the town halls and the public comments that we had received, but we also conducted daily media and social media monitoring, and we facilitated a number of small group sessions and conducted surveys in order to receive further community input as part of our process. To analyze existing conditions, we pulled upon our own public health data sets. We're very fortunate that we have a huge amount of monitoring data that we collect routinely to understand prevalence of chronic conditions in various neighborhoods across our city. And we had robust data from the US EPA in the form of an ambient air quality report that they produced specifically for this health impact assessment that looked at the federal air monitors and compared neighborhoods across the city of Chicago in environmental justice and non-EJ areas so that we could characterize the state of the air on the southeast side. And then we had another federal partner, ATSDR, provide a health consultation that took that US EPA air quality data and actually allowed us to understand what health impacts people were having, even at baseline, even before the RMG application, how just living in proximity to this industrial corridor and breathing that air was affecting their health. And then we did use some traditional environmental and health risk assessment tools. So we created with our environmental consultant an admissions inventory and some on-site soil sampling, and then we put those into more traditional environmental impact and human health risk assessment models. So we had the benefit of those findings. And where we needed to, we conducted literature review because, as I think all of us have come to appreciate in doing this work, there is not one gold standard or one roadmap for exactly how to conduct a cumulative impact or health impact assessment of this type. And so we really did look to literature and to leading edge theory, and we tried to kind of pick and choose those pieces that felt most relevant and applicable to the sort of HIA that we were committed to doing. We also looked to the literature to help us make the link between mental health and well-being and living in proximity to industrial uses so that we could really characterize, not just from the lived experience perspective, but also from the literature review, what we know about how these kinds of conditions affect health and sense of well-being. We've spoken already about valuing lived experience and conducting small group discussions to try to hear from a qualitative standpoint how people thought about benefits and burdens as community members. And then to make our decision ultimately was a bit of an art as well as a science, I will say. You know, we often get asked, how did we weight each individual component of the HIA? And the fact of the matter is, we didn't just weight each individual component. We ranked each individual component on a spectrum from the green here, which is having a strong demonstrated positive impact, to the red, which was a strong demonstrated negative impact on the members of the community. And so for each of those environmental, quality of life, and health impacts, you'll see from this slide, they were given a score that was, or a rating that was tied directly back to the findings of these various pieces of the assessment that we had conducted. Important to note here that when considering health impacts, if you looked just strictly at the human health risk assessment findings from the HIA, there was very little, and in fact, there was negligible, there was no demonstrated additional risk to community members for acute and chronic risks or for carcinogenic risks. But we thought it was important to call out within our health impact assessment that these are neighborhoods that already experience health inequities, that already have higher rates of cancer and chronic illness. So even at baseline, when we're saying we are maintaining the status quo, to maintain the status quo is to perpetuate inequity. And so we tried to be very clear about that in our analysis. We ultimately tied our factors for decision-making back to our research questions. So as you recall, the research question was about community conditions as they exist today. So the factor for decision-making was understanding the extent of existing community burden and vulnerability. We had a research question about benefits. So our decision-making ultimately was also tied to the extent of those potential benefits to Southeast Side residents. Similarly, with negative impacts on each of those domains of environment, health, and quality of life. And finally, we do have authority through our permitting processes to look at the actions of the company itself, including their compliance history. And we weighted particularly heavily in this process, a history and a pattern of practice that we saw with the company of not always doing right by the community and not always operating in compliance with their permit conditions. And given the extent of vulnerability and the extent of risk that this particular kind of large recycling facility operation posed, that allowed us to come to a point of not just requiring mitigations, but ultimately to deny the permit. How am I doing on time, Lubna? Am I way over?
You're a few minutes over, but I think this is an important part. The lessons learned is really what we would love to hear about. So go ahead.
I'll do it just very quickly, but then please ask us lots of questions. On the HIA process lessons learned, we've divided this into lessons about process and tools and methods. First is that we do need new frameworks. CDPH felt a bit like we were out there, just kind of trying to pull upon pieces of best practices, but never fully confident that we were organizing this in the best or the most effective way. I think it is a real challenge that all of us are embarked on together of figuring out how do we really create a conceptual model that combines these traditional environmental impact and human health risk assessments with these critical pieces from other disciplines or other types of assessment that allow us to conduct this robust mixed methods approach. And it does, in some cases, require deriving from theory and from literature review. We think it is very important, and this is one of our biggest lessons coming out of our HIA, is being very explicit about what screening tools will be applied to determine in what cases a health impact or cumulative impact assessment will be required. Because right now, CDPH is a little bit out at the leading edge of our discretion, and we're having to operate on more of a permit by permit basis to determine when and how these kinds of tools will be applied. We're looking to get at a much more rigorous set of screening tools and policies that embody those screening requirements in order to make this standard. We also encourage you all to consider a process evaluation as a necessary part of the HIA itself. So really reflecting on to what extent did the process embody all of the minimum elements and really push towards those best practice standards that the field is really coalescing around. And I think that is part of being accountable and transparent with community partners as well. As far as equity and stakeholder engagement, again, we've painted what probably sounds here like a rosy picture of we did all of this and it fully expressed our values and everyone loved it. That is not the case. This was an incredibly fraught process, and it was a process where because of some of the legal constraints and timelines and the lack of existing foundational trust between government entities and community stakeholders, we were really trying to do what we could within those constraints. But we certainly learned that successful and authentic engagement requires, in many cases, specialized expertise. It certainly requires understanding how to use tools like the spectrum of public participation to be explicit with community about how they will be engaged and to what extent you are truly power sharing at points in the process versus when you may just be educating or informing. We also certainly learned lessons about how important the media is in shaping public narratives and how important it is to have robust communication channels that allow community partners as well as government stakeholders to really kind of co-develop and share information about these processes. So we'll end where we began. These were our core elements of the health impact assessment. I think in each of these have become sort of our central tenets that we carry forward now to future processes, particularly in the industrial and environmental space. But we are very excited now to just open the floor to questions from you. And we'll share these slides. I know we went very quickly through them. So Lubna has them and will disseminate that people can review it at your leisure. Kate, is there anything that you wanted to add on before we just jump into Q&A and you can join in that?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. Really appreciate the overview, and yeah, I feel like there's a lot to discuss here, and I'm sure many of our subcommittee members have questions. As I mentioned, I mean, the relevancy of this presentation, you know, is excellent because this is exactly what we are trying to embark on, is developing kind of recommendations around exactly what you've just done. So let's go ahead and open up the floor. And Ian, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Ian Thomas Tafoya here. I'm the co-chair of the overall task force. I have kind of two questions. One is, can you talk a little bit more about compliance history and how you graded that? And then my second question is, how would you see your new rubric being applicable for a renewal of a permit?
Those are two great questions. And I should say, as I mentioned, we are in active litigation with the company now. So we're going to be as candid as we can with you all today, but we are also constrained on how much we can go into specific elements of this decision. What I can tell you is that for our compliance history review, we did look at the totality of violations that the company had been found liable for in the preceding years of operating on that same campus. And we weighted them more heavily in this process than we have in some other permit processes because we were considering community vulnerability. So when we looked at the fact that this was a neighborhood where people had higher rates of asthma and lower access to care, we felt that even those kinds of violations that in other contexts might not rise to the level of resulting in a permit denial, given the vulnerability and the kind of totality of circumstances here, we gave those additional weight. And then the second part of your question was about how we're thinking about how this applies to renewals. So CDPH now, as a follow-on to this process, is committed to conducting a full baseline cumulative impact assessment for the city of Chicago and using the findings of that to institutionalize requirements around the way that we're going to apply an HIA type process, some elements of what we did with RMG more broadly to different types of permit decisions in the city. I will say, I think we are most likely to be most successful in advancing policies at the space of new permits. But we are also thinking about how we apply some of this to renewal applications as well. There right now is another large recycling facility that's applying for a renewal in the city of Chicago. And although we aren't calling it an HIA and doing the same, many months long process as we did with RMG, we are taking some of these learnings about the kinds of community indicators that are most relevant to our permit decision making. And we're doing kind of a lighter touch, more condensed version of that. It will not necessarily I think it will not put us in a place where we have sufficient authority to deny a currently operating facility its renewal, but it will allow us to take a different look at what kinds of community protections and mitigations can be put into place in that context.
I just have a follow-up question. So in this case, for this facility, is your system designed in which they would get approval from you, then also the state, and then possibly even federal permitting, or how does that operate?
Yeah, there is a complex interplay of all of these various permits. So with something like a large recycling facility, there are both equipment installation and operating permits at the state level, as well as at the city level. And we are working with the Illinois EPA in our cumulative impacts assessment in an attempt to think then comprehensively about how their permitting processes and ours can really build upon some of the same foundational data and be informed by some of these same approaches.
Thank you.
Something, Megan, I think to add on to the first series of questions in talking about like the rubric, here, as Megan mentioned, we really brought in practice from race equity impact assessment, or REIA, REIA. And I think there I would urge and continue to urge everyone to be race explicit. So when you are thinking about the benefits and burdens and how that accrues and who will be impacted, to be as explicit as you can be about race, and to not lose the race part of racial equity impact assessment. And you'll see in our summary report how we got as granular as we could get in terms of how benefits and burdens accrue and at the expense of whom.
I see we have a hand raised. Is that Jaime?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that fascinating presentation. That was just so interesting, and you really look like you checked quite a few boxes, if not all boxes. I just have a couple questions. Number one, does any of your work or any of your efforts have any potential to impact existing permits retroactively?
Yeah, so all of that is going to get worked out through the negotiation of a cumulative impacts ordinance with our city council. So what I can say is that we are bringing all of this information forward, and the reason we're conducting a cumulative impact assessment is to show that even under existing conditions, there are real differences from neighborhood to neighborhood in Chicago in terms of how burdened people are by pollution and how vulnerable they are to negative health effects. But we at the health department cannot by fiat then make some of these changes. It has to be worked out through negotiation with the city council and our kind of political counterparts. So we feel our charge, our mandate is to make some of these impacts explicit and to bring that data forward and to push as far as we can within the scope of just our department's authority. And we will use the findings of the cumulative impact assessment to continue to really heighten our enforcement efforts in those neighborhoods that are most vulnerable. But I will say, I am less confident that we will be able to, start to shut down existing businesses or amortize. That's what we're going to be pushing towards. But I think our more immediate impact may be in spaces around mitigating the effects of existing facilities, continuing to regulate and to enforce against them strongly, and then really to think about some of these tools as being about, what kind of new land use and zoning requirements are going to be put into place for the city.
I could add on to that too. I think we also see our cumulative impacts assessment work as being about narrative change work too, that helps to create the conditions for policy change. And so even in this health impact assessment that we did, which is on like one very limited permitting decision, we were intentional in like really calling out how maintaining the status quo is to perpetuate health inequity and to perpetuate like health inequity by how identities are racialized, right? And so like I think like even that narrative framing, and like we spent some sentences in a very long report there, because like we are also trying to like build that understanding that even to maintain the status quo is to perpetuate structural racism and health inequity. And so I think like we chose some intentional choices in how we set up this work to help with the narrative work that precedes policy and systems change work. And of course, we're only, you know, one small piece of the organizing that needs to be done, but are trying to do our piece.
Wow, excellent.
I think we
answer.
should acknowledge there that a big part of that work was actually not led by the city. It was really our grassroots environmental justice organizers who were shaping that narrative change, who brought this issue to the forefront, who made it front page news on the Chicago Tribune. You know, like a lot of that was about creating the enabling environment that put us in the position to be able to do a health impact assessment, and that will continue to push the city towards cumulative impacts.
Wow, thank you. Such excellent information. And again, I really appreciate you sharing with us. I'm sorry, were one of you about to speak up again?
Well, I was noting that Mira had her hand up too. So just.
Oh, yeah. Real quick, I know a bunch of people raised their hands too. If you wouldn't mind at some point, I'd love to know what kind of outreach efforts you found successful, especially when you were doing outreach to communities and things like that. So thank you again. Great information.
Thank you. Just to touch very briefly on that, because this had become such a prominent citywide issue, a lot of the outreach work was frankly done for us. We used our fairly standard city platforms, posting on our website and on our social media, and we have email listservs of groups that are commonly interested in being updated on environmental permitting processes. It was really a lot, again, to the credit of the grassroots organizations that helped to amplify those messages about community meetings to ensure that people were in attendance. But that is something that we're looking to consider to the future, is really not every permit will get that level of attention. So how do we need to become better and more proactive in our outreach, more accessible in our outreach, so that the folks who need to know do know and can participate in other similar processes in other neighborhoods. Mira, I see your hand.
Yeah, my first question is very similar to Jaime's, which is I was interested to hear you talk about authentic community engagement. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like how you made that engagement authentic, and if there are any lessons learned that we can apply here in Colorado. And then secondly, you know, particularly in terms of like media monitoring and social media monitoring, like that is not something that I think we have a precedent for in Colorado, although I could be wrong. So like
didn't have a precedent for it here either. It was the first of its kind for us.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you did that.
Yeah, I'll take the second question first. And then maybe Kate, we can tag team on talking about the engagement. So social media monitoring is something that we began to do in a more systematic way in a time of COVID, really trying to understand where there was mis or disinformation, and as we were becoming more sophisticated in our use of social media tools. But we pointed some of that at then this question of how are people thinking about and talking about this permit, and did do some, you know, we had a daily digest of social media posts from prominent community leaders, and what are the issues that are being lifted up through those channels, and did some theming of those, and really pulled that then into the scoping. So we found that to be a way, speaking of outreach, you know, not to just say, you've got to come to our meeting to give us this input, but we really were kind of tapping into these channels that already existed and were ways that people were sharing information. To your first question, I think Kate and I would both say that this process was not a shining example of authentic, deep, meaningful community engagement. Some of that was a product of the litigation, and many of the partners that we most wanted to be working in collaboration with during this process were actively suing the city. But more than that, I think it was really, and Kate, maybe you want to talk a little bit about kind of how the inside and outside strategies were playing out here. You've been really eloquent on this point.
And actually, I'll just quickly jump in and note that we've all been speaking a little bit faster. I think we're all excited and our interpreters are having a hard time keeping up. So please do try to keep the conversation a little slower so that we can ensure we have good interpretation.
Yeah, and on that note, I will just, Megan and Kate and Beatriz and Renee as our co-chairs too. If we're okay with extending the time of this session, let's go until 4:15, 4:20 until we feel like we've had all of our questions answered. I feel like the subject matter is so relevant to the conversation that we're about to have about like crafting the recommendations. And so there's a lot to learn from you all. So Megan and Kate, if you are cool with staying on for a few more minutes, that'd be great.
That's fine.
So Megan, you were queuing me up, I think, to talk about inside, outside organizing.
And any other reflections you have
Yep.
on what, allowed us to kind of do or not do successfully our authentic community engagement.
Sure. I think that, so at the highest level in Chicago, for those who may be less familiar with our jurisdiction and the state of relationships, there is a lot of harm that has been done and continues to be done to our environmental justice communities. And the city has been in some ways inconsistent, and that deepens the harm that people feel. And we have, as a city, some real restorative justice work and harm acknowledgement and relationship building work that is being done and needs to continue to be done. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture of that folks are doing things really well. There's a lot of deep work that needs to be done. So for our particular health impact assessment, I think what that resulted in is outside organizing, outside of government organizing, tremendous leadership by grassroots groups, coalitions, advocacy, narrative change work, and there was inside organizing. So I think inside of government, health equity champions working to do what we could from our seats, but there was not great solidarity organizing. So like the inside and outside tracks, it was sort of parallel efforts, which, we would say we hope to never be in that way again, right? We hope to have all three tracks working, right? Outside, inside, outside, and inside. In terms of, I saw a question in the chat around where we fell on the spectrum of public participation. For this health impact assessment that Megan and I talked about, I think we really were at consult and involve. So we didn't get to the higher levels of like co-leadership in co-ownership, deference to community organizations. So we, squarely in the middle of the spectrum of participation. And in our cumulative impacts assessment work, we are working with our environmental equity working group and are aiming for, work that looks much more like collaboration and deference to and shared leadership. So that's what we're aiming to get towards, is to move further into ownership in that work.
Thanks, Kate. And recognizing, of course, that there are some places where we do just need to inform. It is important for community partners to understand the scope of our authority, where we can act and where we cannot, and where we are constrained by rules. And so I do think at different points of decision-making processes too, that's part of why we needed to be more clear about, now we are informing you about the limits of our box. Now we are working with you to co-design a process. Now we are empowering communities to actually, use their voices to describe benefits, burdens. So I think it isn't even so easy as just saying everything happens in this one column of the public participation spectrum. It really is kind of flexing at points.
Yep.
And sorry, do you guys have any sort of toolkits for the nonprofits that were turning individuals out, or was it just primarily sharing the flyers, et cetera?
So we didn't have specific toolkits. That is something as we consider now moving into cumulative impact assessment and doing this fully. We are looking at community workshops and what might it look like to co-host those with nonprofit organizations, and how do we build capacity through this process by sharing tools and resources. So I think that is an aspiration more than it was a part of this individual health impact assessment. But we like that thinking, and it's very consistent with where we hope to grow to. Gary, I see your hand.
Well, thank you both for a wonderful presentation. I get the pleasure of serving on this task force representing workers from disproportionately impacted communities, and wanted to applaud your efforts on the robust evaluation and looking at both physical and mental health issues. Wanted to see if you could kind of share if kind of the social economic challenges that workers face were incorporated in the process, and kind of how those considerations work throughout.
That's an area that we were reflecting on during and after this process. In our scoping, we were really looking at impacts on the neighborhood. So the unit of measurement was the community. We did not have a pathway that we fully and explicitly addressed that was about worker health and the safety of people who were actually to be employed by this facility. But that's an area that we are interested in, we do think is very important. And it was just the kind of limitations of and the demands of this project that we didn't get as deep into that as I think would be appropriate in other cumulative impact assessments. But that's a place where we'd be interested to learn from you too. Are there tools or resources, materials that you are using as you think about that pathway really that is about worker health, worker outcomes?
Thank you so much for the answer. I think we're all trying to solve that riddle as we go along.
Yeah, it was interesting. Some of the most vocal advocates, people standing up in favor of this particular facility, were individuals employed by RMG, some of whom were themselves also community residents. So if anything, we were hearing from those most vocal workers that this is a well-run facility. This is a business that we trust. They are an employer that are giving us living wage, kind of head of household jobs, and in some instances. So there were kind of these pushes in both directions, that both we had concerns about some worker health and conditions on the site. For instance, we found in some locations on the site high levels of lead, that if people were walking through disrupting soil, that could be of a concern to worker health. But then there were also these real, true and authentic kind of countervailing pushes that were about the quality of the employer. And I think one of our lessons too is health impact assessments have to make space for all of that, we need to come into this with a true kind of view towards both the benefits and the burdens, because we do think it is important for people to have jobs that are economically remunerative and are healthy and are located in their neighborhood. So it is kind of trying to figure out how to do all of those things together, and letting an HIA be full enough to hold space for those things.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I think that is a challenge. A lot of times, our at least the members that I know well live in the same communities, and they have the same concerns about health. In addition to, when they're working, they're usually right face to face with all the equipment in the process, but also dependent on the paychecks and the benefits that come along with those kind of job positions. So Thank you for your response.
I think just something I would add to that too is that, this is our pathways are what emerged at that particular point in time as we were doing engagement. The city of Chicago has since released a climate action plan for our city, which is about climate resiliency. And in that plan, issues of a just transition came up much more strongly. So how do workers in industry, like how do you support labor and workers in industry, you know, as they transition to other, as industry transitions into other energy and more sustainable sources. And so I will be interested to see if sort of the organizing and bringing in labor movement into our climate work shows up more now in our cumulative impacts assessment, and if we are hearing more about just transition in addition to health outcomes too. So I think stay tuned there. We'll be glad to share what we hear, but I am wondering if we're going to hear that now.
Renee, I see your hand.
I am so grateful for your presentation. I feel motivated in many ways. I come from Indigenous communities, so often cumulative impacts is also a way to navigate spaces that have had data gaps or erasure, to also have enforceable protections in those spaces. How can we enhance with cultural and trauma sensitivity now with your experience, issues of where it gets into even generational cumulative impacts for disproportionately impacted communities, such as Indigenous communities. Denver has 48 alone, but only one tribal or two tribal sovereign nations that are actually in the state. So it's recognizing what does that look like, and to also bring back restorative justice to those communities, call them back if we're truly going to replace, mitigate, regulate, and how you said, and new land use and zone to replace.
Thank you so much for that comment, Renee, and thank you for grounding us all today with your land acknowledgement. I think we felt immediately that this is a group that is committed to these same sort of values that we're trying to uplift in Chicago. In terms of generational impacts and restorative justice and grappling with this harm, Kate, do you want to talk a little bit about how that is being built into some of our, to the extent possible into this work, but really going forward into some of how we plan to work in partnership with communities?
Yeah, I think even just in the assessment itself, we used some theory and cited it, and go with me on the journey for a moment. The reason that we did that is because that is what some audiences will respond to. Whether that is right is like a whole other Zoom call that I would love to have with all of you. But we really, truly, I would. But we used Nancy Krieger's eco-social theory to talk about how we embody injustice. So not only is social injustice around us, but how does it like become in our bodies, and how that is also generational trauma. So and again, to the best of our ability with the time and the resources that we had, but like we tried to even like pull that language into the assessment. And I think is part of what we will also be bringing in our cumulative impacts assessment work. Of course, that is like not sufficient to actually address all of the intergenerational trauma and to do the historic, like the justice work that is needed, and to really, live out your values. That's only one small way in which we tried to help connect how this really is the cumulative effect. And I think two other thoughts. One, we felt this even in our health impact assessment. There is this desire to pick it apart and say, is it this or is it that? And is it this that really matters? And how much should we weight it? And we've really tried to push that it's the cumulative, and like it's cumulative, it's all of it together, and to resist urges mostly from policy and decision makers to pick a piece of it apart. So I think that feels related to this too, is like you have to be able to talk about the cumulative embodiment of the injustice that people are experiencing. So it's not a full answer, but it's what came to mind that we were able to do in the, in the time frame that we had, but clearly that has to be accompanied by real policy change and a lot of restorative justice work too. The other thing that came up for me is that I don't think we went as far as I would like to have seen us go in acknowledging resiliency too. I think that, in our values, we aim to be strengths-based, and it's easier, or the default in some ways is to be deficit, right? Is to talk about disparities, to talk about inequity. And I think that we, in our health impact assessment, weren't able to, with the time and the resources that we had, to go as far as I think we could or should have done in acknowledging resiliency and strength too.
Thank you. I just appreciate you looking at with all of those contexts. That is true allyship to disproportionately impacted communities, especially recognizing erasures and being able to just address injustice. That is just putting us on the path. So I'm really, really grateful for all of this. And any bridging. So yes, I would be down to have further conversations as well.
Yeah, and we mean that sincerely. We truly do feel like we're all on this journey. And the more that we can continue to share and to learn forward together, Chicago is here for those discussions. And we have already been so impressed, as I was saying in our conversation with Joel and Libna, at the approach that you all are taking. So we'll be watching with great interest as you come back with your recommendations, and really do welcome any further collaboration.
I'll jump in next. I want to say thank you. This gives me a lot of hope, and I'm sure a lot of us on this call are feeling really hopeful right now. But something that we've brought up, and I'm wondering if you guys were able to integrate this into your process, is we are able to mobilize large portions of community to give testimony and share their lived experience in different committees and boards and decision-making processes for like the last 10, 20 years. And a lot of times it's really hard once they've passed through the trauma and their issues were not taken into consideration, but that testimony is still there. And the water agencies and our health agencies and our air quality. Did you guys find a mechanism to reuse those testimonies and those lived experiences so you don't have to like bring community back and the whole trauma, and be sure that what is already out there is information that is also informing the future and not just that one, hearing like that was 2 years ago or something like that?
That is such an important question. And we worried a lot during this HIA process about re-traumatizing people by asking them to come, once again, tell the stories of their children who have asthma and what that means to live across the street from these facilities. So that was why we did things like looked at social media monitoring, because these are forums in which people are already choosing to share. And so trying to collect and to theme from that. We did carry forward everything from our own permitting process, and we looked at the Illinois EPA's permitting process and their public comment as well. But in terms of the kind of really systematic, like reaching broad to see what else other public agencies have collected, we really didn't do much more than what I have just described. I think our hope with the cumulative impact assessment work is that we can do this kind of to the future, have a point in time where we are truly reckoning with the cumulative impacts of pollution in the city. We are, I think, it's a good question for us of how are we going to carry some of this information we've already gathered forward into that process, but also how do we kind of mark this as a time where now we're getting away from just you need to weigh in on the individual permit in your neighborhood and you got to show up each time that public health comes because there's another one of these things before us, and moving more towards this is, as Kate said, the way that we are going to capture that narrative, that lived experience broadly, and now we're going to be able to apply it to all of these subsequent decisions.
Yeah.
Kate, is there more that you wanted to add on that?
I would. So I was, so again, just to kind of reemphasize what we did for the health impact assessment is we did theme, we coded and themed what we had. And that was like our permitting process, so the health department's process. But as Megan said, and we looked at social media, but we didn't have access to this more systematic across city departments and sister agencies in our jurisdiction. I was with our environmental equity working group last Thursday, and that is exactly what they asked us to do for cumulative impacts assessment. Is they said before we even talk about co-designing or hosting or doing any new engagements, like get your SHIT together and like, you know, look at like all of the comments that we have like and the testimony before. And so I think we are wrapping our heads around what might something like that look like. So then we could take it back and ground truth it rather than to start, you know, with the idea in mind that all new engagement sessions need to be done.
I don't see any further questions. I'm not sure if there was anything we missed from the chat box. I'm just looking real quick. I don't think so. Okay. Well, I will put my.
Can I do one more last question? I was just trying to make space for others if there were going to be other questions, but when you documented the benefits and who benefits from this, how did that look? Because like you're talking about like from the deficit and the community where the wealth stays, what was that process and what did that shine, like the benefit aspect of it?
I would say the primary benefits that we saw through this review were climate benefits. You know, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact this is a recycling facility, the purpose of which is to divert huge amounts of material from landfill and put it back into productive use. But when we looked at who benefits from that, it really is that is a citywide benefit. It is consistent with our climate action plan and with our goals around reuse. But there was not a particular benefit to the surrounding neighborhood with respect to increasing the citywide recycling capacity and that sort of ecosystem of recycling. The other benefit that was put forward by the company was that this would be a benefit to the workers. This would be representing something like 50 new jobs. But when we did deeper analysis into who was really being employed by this company and other companies operating within the Southeast Side Industrial Corridor, the finding was that most of these jobs were not going to neighborhood residents. And that really on the scale of need, when you look at unemployment on the Southeast Side, the number of jobs that this particular facility represented was quite small. So while we did look at benefits, I think our general finding was that benefits accrued to the city, but when you looked at who was experiencing the burdens, that was the residents of the Southeast Side.
That's right. So that like follow-up question of who will be impacted was really important for our assessment. So the generation or the brainstorm of benefits and burdens, but then getting as specific and granular as we could with our stakeholders about but who would get those benefits and who would be burdened. And what we found is this disparity and equity in citywide benefits and burdens for the communities themselves.
Thank you.
Awesome. Megan and Kate, thank you so much for sticking around for a few extra minutes. Yeah, and really appreciate your thorough presentation and answers to all of our questions. Like we said before, we really do feel like this is the beginning of an ongoing partnership. And, while there is so much that we have to learn from you, and I'm sure that as we go through this process, we want to continue sharing our resources and what we are developing with you all as well. So, and thank you for providing your contact information in the chat. I'm sure our task force members would love to stay in touch. So.
Thank you for having us. This work is hard, this road is long, but it fills up our cups to know that people like you are doing it as well. So thanks for the chance to come together in partnership tonight.
Yes, thank you for having us in your space, sending you all the sparkles in solidarity.
Take care.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your undivided attention and great questions, which I think will continue to inform our recommendations as we put pen to paper. It is now 4:26 Mountain Time, and I would love to give people just a bit of a break before we jump into the recommendations discussion. Let's go ahead and take about like a 5 or 6 minute break. I don't want to take, sorry, it's going to be short. I just want to make sure that we get to our recommendations. So let's return at 4:33. So about a 5-minute break. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that gave folks a chance to take a quick break. And we have about a little over an hour before we begin our public comment period. Public comment will take place in the last about 20 minutes of the meeting. And if folks are back at their desk, thanks Ilda for the thumbs up, but if you could just indicate similar to Ilda by turning your camera back on or just giving me a emoji to let me know that you are back in the space, that'd be great. Okay. Well, it looks like people are slowly coming back. And I just dropped a link to the relevant folder on our within our equity analysis subcommittee folder that is draft recommendations. Please do keep in mind these draft recommendations again are these are specific to this subcommittee, so you won't see the full list of ideas that we talked about at our April meeting. Version 1 that you can see in that folder if you're in there. Version 1 is what we talked about at the last meeting on April 27th. Version 2 includes the edits from the conversation that we had last month. And so you can see that version 2 is slightly different. We're not going to look at it in this format for the purpose of this meeting. What I've gone ahead and done is created a slide for every single one of the bulleted recommendations or reoccurring questions. And I will go ahead and share my screen and we can go through this kind of question by question. I just dropped a link to that slideshow into the chat. So go ahead and click in there. And I want to just see kind of, it feels like the most productive way to do this is to kind of collectively be able to like edit these sticky notes. So you can ignore slide 2. Slide 2 is just a link to the draft recommendations that I just pointed out, version 2 of those recommendations. But touching on slide 3, this is kind of, so the first recommendation that's listed in that document, I put here into a slide. In terms of format, what we thought would be helpful, and thanks for the suggestion, Renee, to kind of work in this style and like a Jamboard style where we can, of course, have a verbal discussion and we'll continue taking notes. Joel and Morgan are taking extensive notes on our entire conversation. But in addition to that, folks that may kind of think differently or want to like put their ideas in writing, feel free to click into any of these sticky notes and insert your ideas that way. The thought here is that we'll spend anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes on each of these slides or each of these recommendations. And this is kind of our way to really drill down and get to some very detailed recommendations. As we're thinking through this, one way I've been thinking about it is like, how can we make some of these recommendations like SMART? That's kind of a model that we use when we're talking about objectives, like laying out objectives. For those who are not familiar with the acronym SMART, and I'll drop a link to kind of what might be helpful. I just found a random resource online, but when we say SMART, we're talking about specific, measurable, achievable or attainable, relevant, and time-bound. We don't necessarily need to click, check all of these boxes, but something that we do want to think about as we are talking about these recommendations. Are we looking at these recommendations and including language that is realistic, that is something that is specific. So with that said, I think what I'll do is just go ahead and I don't know if it's preferred that I do a screen share or not, or if people want to follow along on their own. Any strong opinions there on whether you would prefer that I share my screen so you can follow along with me?
Yes, please.
Sorry, Renee, what did you say?
Yes, please. Screen share.
Okay, great. So I will go ahead and screen share, and let's see here. So we are on slide 3. Can you see this okay? Am I on the right screen? Okay. Great. So we are on slide 3. In the question or the recommendation here is related to what we talked about, like in terms of a feedback loop. So an environmental equity analysis is intended to benefit disproportionately impacted communities. So the community should inform the equity analysis, and the analysis should help inform the community. I don't want to like really heavily facilitate this, the way that we're going to go about this. So folks, feel free to kind of use this as a work session. If you would like to insert things into the post-its, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, just come off of mute and kind of share your thoughts on this recommendation and, you know, its relevancy, how it can be improved. You know, we can even kind of get into wordsmithing here if you would like. So I'll pause there.
So Levna, this is Trisha, maybe just a more broad question. So I think what I am hearing you suggest is it would be really great for the subcommittee to really try to take some of these thoughts and turn them into, you know, specific recommendations, as you said, that meet the SMART pieces. So are like specific and measurable. So for this, like, I guess this wouldn't get at the feedback loop part of it and more just about the first piece of the loop of the community should inform the equity analysis. So are you saying, would your suggestion be like the task force recommends that an equity analysis is informed by the community? Is that kind of what we're trying to get to? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So these recommendations, and just to be clear again from, you know, how we presented this at the last meeting, none of these ideas are from the EJ program staff, right? This is stuff that has come from you all. You know, either one or more task force members have suggested this. We've gone through all of the notes and kind of pulled out what we are hearing are recommendations. And so, yeah, you can put that kind of, that like precursor to all of these recommendations. The task force recommends that, you know, and then in this case, an environmental equity analysis is intended to benefit DI communities. The community should inform the equity analysis, and then the analysis should help inform the community. That's what we've heard kind of time and time again during these meetings. And so we've kind of formulated this into a recommendation and look to you all to see if this is, you know, is this spot on? How, if not, like, how should it be adjusted?
I could take a first crack at starting to put some meat into this recommendation. I mean, I think community engagement has to be a part of the equity analysis. I think feedback from the community accumulated through town halls, through public comment, through listening sessions with community groups should be used to inform scoping of the equity analysis. Prioritization of factors that go into the equity analysis to reflect priorities in the community, and then also the construction of narratives within the equity analysis. I personally love the idea that was raised during the Chicago presentation of not just face-to-face communication with the public and public comment, but also incorporating narratives from the media and social media. I think that is likely difficult to do well, but I think also it reflects the way we communicate in our modern times, and reflects the way that, you know, ordinary people, particularly people who are not necessarily super well connected with our existing institutions, express their views. We do tend to express our views on social media. So I think that's if it can be incorporated, I think that's great. So that's just my initial thoughts on how we make this recommendation more detailed and more measurable.
Thanks for that, Mira. And yeah, please do, share those types of ideas of like, kind of namely what we might want to, specify in these recommendations. Like, your suggestion that we, we incorporate social media as a form of feedback. I mean, we have the opportunity to like be very specific about what we are talking about here. So other ideas, please share them.
I have one. I want to ensure that whatever feedback we receive, regardless of source, needs to be verifiable, right? If we are talking about using these feedback to inform policy decisions, we need to make a distinction between anecdotes and feelings and those of verifiable sources. Because as much as I want to have opinions and stuff from social media, it's really hard to appease everyone without knowing what the facts are. And I think that's going to be an important distinction for us as we do that outreach and get input from all corners of our state, that whatever we do include in our report and recommendations ties back to something verifiable.
Do others have thoughts on that? And Beatriz, I saw that you had come off mute earlier too.
Yeah, something that I really appreciated from the presentation is that local organizations that really are in the trenches with community are seen as experts and as key partners for decision making as well. So I think it's really important to highlight like who is in the community and who has the connections, and using those trusted sources from and infrastructures from within the community is really important.
And one thing I would say is, as we're thinking about this, if it's like if the Chicago example was around a specific permitting action. And so if we're talking about, we still haven't kind of grappled, I think, with like, is an equity analysis something that an agency does with like every single permitting action or every single, or is it something that's going to be more like done on a regional or community basis? And I think that could impact this discussion as well in terms of like how do we do engagement? Because if it's an equity analysis that an agency does for or like every single permitting action, for example, that's like hundreds or even thousands of actions that an agency might take in a year. And so I think that the scaling of like how you do the outreach is different in that kind of a situation than it is if you're doing the more like global one where you can really like get into the town halls and those kinds of things, which I think are really great suggestions. I just think we need to think about how we scale it depending on when an equity analysis is being done.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think following best practices of community engagement, there should be, and especially with the engagement around nonprofits, that should be adequate toolkits in to provide to community multiple languages in the meantime as some of these sort of focus groups or community meetings are being presented. So nonprofits have the tools and resources to also reach out to their networks.
Something I think was really important about this presentation, I think it goes back to your comment, author, is they were able to prove that these communities where this facility was going to go already had a life expectancy of 9 years less than the rest of the community. So for me, that is proof, right? That is considered. And I think tagging that with a narrative of a person, then it's like, here's the proof, right? Here's the data. Now, what are the specific factors? It's probably really hard, but if a whole community is suffering a similar consequence because of environmental justice, and then you add the narrative component and the lived experience component to that, while it might not seem, it'll seem subjective, but not objective, we already know for a fact that that community lives 9 years less. So I think that validates that narrative and that lived experience, where it becomes the narrative of those 9 years less of expectancy of life. Was that the point that you were trying to get to?
Yeah, I think so, because like, you know, without, let's use that example, without that, you know, 9-year life expectancy delta, that gives those efforts in that community a target to improve on versus, you know, just if we choose another community without that kind of metrics and it's all based off social media and feelings and anger, that doesn't give us a target to know that we're making, you know, tangible steps of improvement, right? And so I don't want these recommendations in this task force to be consumed by the squeaky wheel, but more to what you're saying, verifiable things that verify those squeaky wheels in those communities, that this is a real community that needs help. I want to make a distinction between, you know, I just want to make sure that we have a target within these communities. Otherwise, we won't make any progress despite all the great intentions that we have here.
Real quick, one of the things I see as a possible impediment to that verification is that in a lot of our disproportionately impacted communities, one of the main impacts is the fact that we don't have data. That's one of the main problems in my community specifically, is that we lack data. We have very inadequate air monitoring. We only have one air monitoring site in our community, and our Pueblo Department of Health and Environment doesn't have access to, in a lot of cases, the information that EPA has about Pueblo or CDPHE has about Pueblo's air quality. And so those avenues of data sharing are not open currently, and our communities lack the knowledge, or my community specifically lacks the knowledge of what the air quality is like in the neighborhoods where people actually live. The only information we really have right now is the self-reporting from the polluters themselves, which definitely does show disproportionate impacts of pollution. But we also know that self-reporting is not always the most reliable. We've seen situations where these emitters of air toxics specifically have changed their numbers in response to regulation that they saw coming down the pipe in order to avoid being looped into that regulation. And so I think these are things that we have to take into consideration. I'm not necessarily speaking against getting things verified, but an impediment to getting things verified sometimes is the lack of data. And right now we definitely do have disparate health impacts in Pueblo. Unfortunately, that data that we're missing is the link to those disparate health impacts and the disproportionate number of air toxics, specifically polluters, that we have in our community. And these are respiratory and cardiovascular health impacts that I'm referring to that we have that are increased compared to state averages. And so, you know, this could take who knows how long to gather the data needed to verify that those polluters in our community are linked to those disparate health impacts, for example. So I think there needs to be a lot of thoughtfulness going into these conversations and these processes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And like, I think that is a clear recommendation of, we need to have the data to understand what we are attacking in these communities and improve it. Because, you know, I'm from Pueblo as well. So without that data telling us where to go, I don't think you're suggesting that we just do everything for Pueblo, right? We have to figure out what those are through verifiable sources and data. And maybe the first recommendation is we need that data. Second is creating, you know, the rubric. And I think we had this conversation at a previous meeting of like, it isn't that the data doesn't exist. It's just in raw form for most communities and they don't know what to do with it. And that's an area where we can certainly help of streamlining, hey, these are the data points that matter. These are the data points that give us a sense of what's happening in these communities. It's just because these data sets exist. It's just a matter of, it's hard to read.
They don't exist. In Pueblo,
Someone would disagree with that.
no, we don't have community-based air monitoring. We have polluter-based air monitoring, and we have one site on Fountain Elementary School, one site with only a small handful of monitors that are all within 4 to 5 feet of each other. So we don't have the data about the air in the neighborhoods where people actually live their lives.
Well, we need to create the data.
And that could
doing
take
something
years.
without the data is just throwing stuff against the wall and saying what sticks.
Well,
we need data to know what we're
collecting the data could take years, in which time there is harm being done. There's pollution being spewed into our airs, and we are seeing disparate cardiovascular and respiratory, specifically health impacts in our community. So harm is being done while we're talking about and working on gathering data. We have to keep that in mind too.
Thanks, Jamie and Arthur. Mira, I know you have had your hand raised, so I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I raised my hand to make pretty much the same point as Jamie, and don't need to belabor it, but at the same time, I think that's exactly what I mean by public comment needs to inform the scoping of these cumulative impacts analysis, because lack of data can't be an excuse not to study something that is important to the community. And to include those community priorities in the analysis. Because I think you really, like, the temptation is, if we need data in order to include a factor in the equity analysis, then it's a chicken and egg problem. Like, we've never studied a particular impact because we've simply never tried. And we've never tried because we don't have the data. So that, like, that chicken and egg problem, that excuse is what I think we need to, that is the, like, avoiding that, I think, is one of the purposes of the task force. That's why it exists.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, very relevant points. And I just want to point out that we do have a whole set of recommendations specifically coming from the Data and Reducing Health Disparities Subcommittee. And I feel like we're kind of diving into that space right now, and just for the sake of kind of moving the conversation along, and points are noted. As you can see, the slide is filled up. Thank you, Joel, for taking note of all of that. But we will, I think we have what we need to continue to craft this recommendation and contribute to the data recommendations that you all are referring to. So moving on to our next recommendation, a lot of conversation around benefits and burdens to disproportionately impacted communities, and how these should be incorporated into an equity analysis. And so some examples are like workforce development, for example, on the benefit side, and then quantifying the cost of health impacts on the burden side. So this is just an example. Other ways that folks want to elaborate on or continue to craft this recommendation.
Yeah, the only thing I would want to add is making sure that when we're doing the analysis that we're capturing all of the data points. One of the things that's pretty common, or that what I've seen, especially in the construction industry, is if you look at a facility, a lot of times the only workforce that's captured is those specific jobs hired at the facility once it's constructed, built, and operating, but failing to recognize any of the jobs that were produced for the construction phase of a facility and the ongoing major operations and outages. And so a lot of these facilities, you have, a ton of different construction crafts that are going in at set intervals every few months, and lots and lots of workers that are earning paychecks and health insurance and all the fringe benefits, but don't a lot of times get captured during that workforce analysis because of the separation of them, being employed by outside contractors that are coming and performing the work on the facilities. And like I said, there's a number of plants that I've worked at where I think, that workforce piece is as large or even larger than the internal workforce for a facility.
Folks can just go one after another after, so Renee and Ilda.
I think we also need to define in some spaces what we mean by data and data points, because we also need to work in a duality to address Jamie's issue on communities, because it is the same in Commerce City too. And we're leaving out, again, by the status quo, whole communities if we don't address that there is not existing data, and that we're also having the duality burden of having to do that. So health impact assessments need to be continuous and a form of, I guess, present data monitoring, but recognizing who's already burdened in those spaces and how those have generational impacts to cumulative impacts. I really appreciated in the presentation how all of this is cumulative impacts. The more that we see is another context. So I think that we need to not just go over how Jamie's specific point is that since a lot of industry has been in this space to regulate themselves, where can we recognize if that has had any impact in community to now have their own form of monitoring and mitigating? Because this is also where we can have continuous long-term data as well. We need to recognize also that I've been noticing where was I going? Sorry. The health benefits as well. Communities can also see certain new sectors that can also have benefits in their communities, trades, other forms of, I guess, sector development with community cultural sensitivity and trauma sensitivity going forward also in data. This is a way to transform communities in a different dynamic. And I'm trying to get this in a way then display it also in data. It's really, really hard. So it's more than just health impacts, but socioeconomic impacts, health, housing costs. Like there's a lot of things that go into cumulative impacts we're not weighing when we're talking about data. So I'd like to kind of get down a definition of what we mean by data too, because this does also eventually impact the workers in the community, how we're going to have certain populations represented in those workers in the community as well, especially in spaces like Commerce City, where it goes from now an agricultural space to a transportation space. But a lot of the communities are being hugely developed in like this housing population spaces, but none of them actually work here in this space specifically. So kind of recognizing these different dynamics than we had in Chicago and how we're trying to define data here.
Yes, 100%, Renee. And I think piggybacking on the data about workers, also being able to have a health analysis of the workers in these areas, something that doesn't often get displaced by this entity seeking permits.
Thanks, Renee and Ilda. Any other thoughts on this specific recommendation of benefits and burdens to disproportionately impacted communities being incorporated into the equity analysis and what that should look like? I think we already have some good recommendations about the recommendations here. And the more we go through this, the more I think we may start to combine some of these recommendations and like restructure the way that we are looking at how we're laying this out. From the last recommendation and this one, there is a lot of overlap, once again, with the data subcommittee and the lines that they're thinking along. So just something to keep in mind is that while we might not have this wordsmith, we are kind of thinking through those parallels. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, great. So this one is a little bit harder to see because there was like kind of a lot of like sub recommendations under this recommendation that we wanted to point out. And again, you all have the link to the PowerPoint in the chat. So if you want to follow along on your own and open this up on your own screen, you're welcome to. I'll just read through this briefly. The recommendation is that an equity meta-analysis that considers cross-media cumulative impacts for a region should be conducted by a centralized agency or a consultant. Centralizing the analysis will create efficiencies for state agencies and make engagement in a single process more efficient for communities. So what we're talking about here is kind of like an overarching equity analysis, and then something that can be then catered or tiered. And yeah, just a quick note is that this is coming directly out of the last conversation that we had as an equity analysis subcommittee, the meeting that we had on April 27th. You know, and I think Tricia, you kind of you spoke to this a bit about kind of what this would do in terms of having a baseline for all agencies, but then being able to kind of cater to what each agency is doing. So the meta-analysis or analysis could be conducted for specific regions. So for example, Commerce City, North Denver, to provide a very region-specific lens. So keep in mind that we're building in this ability to, to make this a personalized equity analysis. This meta-analysis should apply to all agencies, again, like I said, across the state, and then agencies can tier to the analysis when making agency-specific decisions. Agencies should consider how to incorporate the equity analysis into their decisions as early as possible in the process, and then ensure that agency staff, boards, and commissions understand and are empowered or required to use the centralized equity analysis when decision making. So, a lot of different pieces there, but open to any thoughts or comments on this recommendation.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we did our best as your staff to try to synthesize and condense the really great conversation at the last meeting. We might not have gotten it perfect. So if anyone sees some of this and was like, that was my idea, but that's not exactly what I was trying to get at, the text here, we can obviously adjust if we didn't get the gist of the discussion correctly represented here.
I was just going to add that in addition to like efficiencies for the agencies and for community engagement, I also see some real opportunity here for being able to look at cumulative impacts in a more powerful way. Like if you're doing an equity analysis of a community as a whole, you can really be looking at cumulatively all of the impacts that the sources within that area have. Whereas when you're looking at each facility by facility, sometimes there's the risk of sort of parsing it out in a way that then you aren't capturing like the overall impacts.
Trisha, to your point, and I'm just kind of reading back through this recommendation, that, you know, I think we incorporated that, you know, looking at just cross-media cumulative impacts for region. Does that touch on what you're kind of referring to there? Or is there something more we should be elaborating on that I'm, you know, not quite capturing?
No, that's a good point. Yeah, no, that is exactly what I mean. So I was just looking more at like that second sentence and thinking that, yeah, no, you're right, it is in there.
Yeah, and folks, also feel free, Beatrice, I see that you're in there. Feel free to type directly into this PowerPoint too, if you don't, if you kind of want to just write it out. Yeah, Mira.
Sure. I guess, you know, I would agree with this recommendation. I sort of see it as both and, though, because I think, you know, when we analyze the status quo in the communities and the existing impacts, what we're not analyzing and collecting data on is the impacts on top of the status quo that could potentially be caused by proposed actions. And, you know, I take the point that there is a lack of administrative capacity. So perhaps, you know, what we need to discuss is how we determine which state actions receive that extra analysis. But I guess I hesitate to sort of stop here. You know, I think doing the meta-analysis is really valuable, but I think that should not be to the exclusion of analyzing the further impacts of proposed state actions where necessary.
Yeah, I think that we had, you know, hoped that that further action was kind of built into this, but I appreciate you kind of pointing that out and making sure that we elaborate on that. Because again, I think, you know, the idea is that there is this meta-analysis, but then, you know, what can we do to have it be really specific when it like needs to get to that level. So.
Lubna, maybe that's a good segue into the next slide. I don't want to rush us, but I think there was kind of that separate concept that was really related to Mira's point about kind of the potential thresholds that could be set on individual decisions through the analysis. So I don't want to push us, but maybe that's a good time to go there since we couldn't fit them all on a single slide.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So, for the centralized regional equity analysis should consider setting a maximum quantified and enforceable threshold beyond which further pollution is not permissible without mitigation due to the cumulative health impacts, considering past, present, and future cumulative impacts. So this was like, you know, the conversation that we had last month, like, what is the threshold? What is the point where like absolutely no more can happen? And, you know, should we build in a recommendation around that? And I think this is an area where we could probably have more specificity. So welcome feedback here.
And I'll just reiterate, we did our best to take, I think in this case, 5 or 6 different comments we heard from different folks last time and mesh it all together. So that doesn't mean we did it perfect. And if this idea doesn't exactly line up with what folks thought we were talking about last time, or someone thinks we missed part of their idea, you know, weigh in. We may not have gotten it all perfect.
I have a question, Joel. So something that I liked about the presentation is that they are noticing, as they mentioned, like this health discrepancy. And I felt like it's not just about denying one single permit, but how to eradicate environmental justice from those communities, right? I felt like that was at least that's how I understood it, right? That we're seeing this health discrepancy in certain neighborhoods and in certain areas of the city. And we want to make, those like health outcomes and life expectancy the same as their white counterpart peers. So that for me was like a proactive approach to not only avoiding new permits, but then also proactively working so those health outcomes and life expectancies are equal amongst throughout the whole city. Did I understand that? Is that what everybody else understood? But I mean, ideally that would be great, right? So we get to this equal playing field.
So for me, I think I understand this to be like tied to the circumstances that the folks from Chicago had in front of them in terms of either a new facility or a facility moving into a neighborhood and having like some kind of threshold where you're saying, well, you'd be able to assess, okay, the community is already at X threshold, and therefore bringing in a new facility would put it beyond that threshold, and therefore the application is not approved. That's kind of how I understand this slide and the suggestion. And so it ties back a little bit to the conversation Beatrice and I were having in the comments on the slide before this about like to do something like that. Like I don't know exactly what authorities the city had to be able to do that, but to me it brings up this question of like, what is the framework by which whichever agency is being told to do this is doing it? Because this is kind of this is framed as the equity analysis would set the thresholds, but there may be a question of like assessing what authorities or empowerment an agency would have to look at those thresholds. So for example, I think I shared in the last meeting that under the Clean Water Act, there is a whole framework for this, right? Like if a water body is impaired, there's a framework and an ability for an agency to not allow additional pollution into that water body. But I'm not aware of that kind of framework and empowerment in other environmental media. So I just would want to make sure that we're thinking through like what exists, what would we need in order for this to work, and who's the right body to provide that.
Any other thoughts on that, on the recommendation in general, but also on the last point that Trisha made about, if we would need to think about like an authority that could provide that kind of, this is the maximum threshold and we need to enforce it this way.
We also have to be wary of that too, though, because that was even recognized in the presentation for policy and legislation, those that might only be working for an agenda. So being mindful where Beatrice was mentioning long-term health outcomes. So making sure that the community knows what that looks like and that it comes from their self-determination, that has to be key even in this space when we talk about data. What is the community self-determination to health outcomes, health benefits, cumulative impacts as well?
Ian, you can go ahead.
As I read this, what I really struggle with is without mitigation, because as we move through these processes, in particular at the AQCC, we got commitments regarding the greenhouse gas mitigation that there wouldn't be offsets. And then when it got moved over to CDOT, they called it mitigation. But I feel like mitigation and offset comes to this idea that there are solutions for some of the pollution. And we've struggled with having to go to another realm where you have to fight for what a fair mitigation strategy is. you know, to give you an example, they talk about bike lanes or walkways, let's just say around 270. Great, but if the overall air quality is a problem, but we don't know where the point of origin for the traffic actually is, that's not necessarily an equal mitigation to the issue, right? Like, and I just, mitigation acts like there's like a sum that adds up to benefit the community, and there are just some things like additional pollution that can't be mitigated for the overall impacts, and it's certainly, I think, an issue that the local frontline communities take offense to at times and have pushed back on, we know, consistently.
Yeah, thank you for noting that, Ian. Other thoughts on this? Okay, so moving on to our next recommendation, and I think this one could probably have a little bit more detail. There's been a lot of conversation about qualitative or trauma-sensitive data and how that should be incorporated into a cumulative impacts analysis. So yes, feel free to elaborate on this and provide further ideas or suggestions.
A basic health and safety impact assessment in and around communities that is cultural and trauma sensitive. So there's no language barriers, understanding digital divides, being mindful of video testimonies, any way that you can both include community without re-traumatizing them and hopefully providing them incentive to change their communities with real enforceable protections and mitigations.
Thanks. Feel free to, again, participate via the sticky notes or just come off mute.
I'll just note some of you talk a little more quickly than others, and I'm able to capture more of what you say. But I'll just flag Renee and Mira in particular. I may not always get every word, so obviously you all can edit this and correct anything I miss in the note taking.
No worries. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Joel.
Yes, noted. Several comments about mental health. Any other additions that we should like be a little bit more specific about when we're talking about qualitative or trauma sensitive data?
One that crosses my mind is, you know, you take trains, for example, or until recently, the passage of the new law with fracking fluids as being proprietary. I think that like those kinds of proprietary information need to be pointed out as data gaps. And I think there also needs to be acknowledgement that like communities that are closest to point source emissions, i.e. a fracking well or trains traveling through the community, deserve to have access to that information, and that pathways for that data justice need to be made.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And another parallel to our data recommendations, I'm feeling more and more that we'll need to really go back and think about how we can consolidate some of these recommendations and kind of put some of these subcommittee ideas together. Okay. Oh, Jamie, I saw you came off mute.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to agree with and bolster Ian's point that, and just mention that the fact that the data doesn't exist in and of itself is an injustice. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But yeah, I agree. The data is important. It's an injustice that it's not there. And what I was going to say is, if the data does exist in some sense or another, or on some platform or another, and it's not available to the community at large, or not being shared with the community, that also in and of itself is a huge injustice.
Thanks, Jamie. Ilda?
Yeah, a piece of data that we have to be sensitive that we're not going to have available, it's immigration status of individuals. One, because it's something that is very difficult to collect, but also to become adequate, but also we do not want to collect that data because we don't want it to be available for any law enforcement. But just understanding that piece of being able to be maneuvered in specific areas of the impact and analysis that needs to be done in those communities.
Excellent. Thank you all for that. One thing I'll just make note of, because I feel like there's probably a lot more that we can talk about. We're going to move on to the questions, so these first few slides were the recommendations that we have been kind of hearing time and time again, and that we've actually formulated. We're going to shift now to the questions, but please keep in mind that this PowerPoint has been shared with you, and so you can continue to edit this even after the meeting. Okay, so big picture questions now. So how exactly should decision making take an equity analysis into account? We've touched on some things already, but would love for folks, for things that we haven't necessarily talked about, if there's room for elaboration here from our task force members. Go ahead, Ian.
Well, one of the biggest things that came up as we passed the air toxics bill this year, and you saw from Chicago that they didn't touch on, is permit renewals and how equity analysis is going to apply to permit renewals, not just new facilities. And I think that that's a challenging question that we haven't been able to figure out at the state level yet, but it's something that the local communities have been asking for.
I just agree with you, Ian, that this is a really important and really challenging question. I agree. I don't think we have figured out yet at the state level.
Go ahead, Mira.
Sure. Yeah, and one thing that we've encountered on our end is that equity analyses and equity considerations really need to be taken into account when considering alternate proposals proposed by third-party interveners in regulatory processes. So things that have happened in the past, for example, is that like the state proposes either through the AQCC or the WQCC or some other regulatory body. The state proposes a particular regulatory proposal. A third-party intervener, say like the regulated facility, proposes an alternate proposal. Environmental justice and environmental advocates do not have the capacity to get involved in every regulatory proceeding, and they are caught off guard when the alternate proposal provided by the regulated entity is adopted. And I think there needs to be just as much sort of equity backstop for alternate proposals that could potentially be adopted as there is for the initial sort of regulatory proposal provided by the Air Pollution Control Division or the other state body that's participating in that process. So wanted to flag that.
Thank you. Yeah, really important point. Appreciate that. Okay, I will move on to the next question. Again, feel free to kind of hang back and peruse through these slides as we're walking through together. All right, so another question, should the definition of state action expand beyond rulemaking, permitting, and enforcement? Should equity analyses be required for both rulemaking and permitting? Thoughts and opinions here?
I think it also needs to include planning, because planning is the first step for so much of the transportation projects and other things.
I agree, because that goes into land use and zoning.
Yeah, jumping off of Ian's point, I'd include utility resource planning in this bucket, which can have pretty significant equity implications.
Any other thoughts here before we move on to, if state action should expand beyond rulemaking, permitting, and enforcement?
I don't know how to express this, but I'm thinking about like follow the money, right? So like how is money transferred to local regions? We're seeing that play out some with greenhouse gas mitigation now, but also in grant making, because we know grant making matters, and how does equity come into their scoring is something that I think about in particular, as we've talked about SCPs and things, but maybe it goes beyond that. I just don't have the full scope of how money fits into it as well.
Is there general consensus that equity analyses should be required for both rulemaking and permitting? Any thoughts on that not happening? Is anybody opposed to this recommendation, this question turning into a recommendation? And that's a good point of clarification, Kelly. The question is at all agencies or a subset of agencies? Whether the rulemaking and permitting should be for all agencies or just some. So food for thought there.
I'm not at all opposed for being part of both rulemaking and permitting, but I think it all depends on how ultimately we structure everything. To Trisha's earlier point, if it's individual analysis that have to be completed for every actionable item, how do we continue to make the process work overall? So I think, how it gets structured at the end of the day makes it possible for both of them. And quickly, I agree with Ian's previous point about how monies are awarded and kind of grant processes. What I would want to make sure we don't do is if we have smaller cities and communities that don't have resources as say the large cities like Denver or Aurora do, we don't create burdens that prevent them from accessing grant dollars for those smaller communities that have less resources.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating on that point, Gary. Any others on this? Okay. All right, moving on to our next question. So should an equity analysis take place or be considered incrementally at different stages of decision making? And so what we've heard kind of time and time again are these four kind of stages. So modeling, permitting, monitoring, enforcement. Are we in planning? Thank you, Joel. So, you know, thoughts from our task force members, should we shift this into the recommendation category? Is this a question, you know, that we want to continue to contemplate? Or are we on board with an equity analysis should take place at all four of these stages?
At all.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I don't disagree. This is just a more of a question. Like how would, and I haven't thought about, or I don't think we've talked much about an equity analysis either taking place or being considered for monitoring. So I just want to pause there a second and understand that. Is it about, maybe it's about, Jamie, the point that you have raised around making sure that decisions about where monitoring equipment is deployed, that there's consideration of equity? Is that what this would be getting at?
Yeah, I definitely see that as
Okay.
aspect. There possibly more that I'm missing, but yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
Thanks.
If I'm remembering correctly, I do think that that was the conversation that we heard in a prior meeting that led us to put this question here. It was the question about where monitors are deployed. Though, Lubna, if you are remembering differently, please weigh in. We've kind of again condensed a lot of these conversations into a short document. So.
Yeah, that's definitely the example that comes to mind. But Trisha, I appreciate you bringing that up because, again, you know, going back to the idea of like smart recommendations, we do want to include as much detail as possible. Like, you know, imagine somebody reading this and then having these questions about, okay, like you mentioned that we want to do an equity analysis at the monitoring phase. Like, what does that even look like? What are you talking about? We want to get to that level of detail and elaboration here. So keep the ideas coming. I just want to reiterate also that these like the time here in these meetings is super important because you know, these ideas cannot be coming from the EJ program staff. So while like Joel and I might have opinions on what this should look like and how to elaborate on it further, we do really need the opinions and thoughts and comments to come from our task force members. So just want to reiterate that. It might feel like glaringly obvious for you sometimes that like, well, duh, like this, you know, you could just answer this, but that's not really within our authority. So.
Thanks for that context, Lubna. And with that in mind, I would just say that a lot of us, or at least I, as a task force member, don't have a deep understanding of how processes work at the CDPHE or the PUC or certain other agencies. And so it's helpful to have input from Trisha and other staff at CDPHE and folks that do have some of that knowledge about how some of these processes work so that we can try to give productive comments and feedback.
Great.
Sorry, thanks, Jamie. And maybe just one last comment on the slide before. I mean, similarly, I hadn't thought about or remember much conversation about how to think about an equity analysis around modeling. So again, I mean, I could see it if our recommendation is around thinking about I mean, again, it sort of depends on whether or not the equity analysis is done at a sort of meta level, or whether we're talking about how to I'm struggling with how do you do an equity analysis when you're doing modeling, right? So modeling is about looking at a facility's permit application and modeling, will they be able to meet their permit limits and requirements? And so I'm struggling with how you do an equity analysis around that. But if it's maybe one way to do it is, if there's a meta equity analysis and we're making recommendations about when an agency is taking into consideration that equity analysis in their decision, maybe part of it is figuring out, maybe that weighs into a decision about whether or not modeling is conducted. I'm thinking out loud, but I'll put some more thought into that one as well.
Yeah, Ian and Mira.
Yeah, just in response to that, I think, cumulative pollution loads outside of just your one source is a way in which the community's been asking for more equity analysis. And I think the health-based standards that are going to develop over the next years are going to talk about ambient air standards and how permits compare to those. And then I also think there's we ran into this with I-70, now it's in 260, so we don't have to worry about it, but PM 2.5 wasn't modeled for, so we had to do it ourselves. And so is there some discretion or compelling of agencies to go above and beyond to model for other things that may be of concern, so that there's a greater understanding of the overall impact, even if it's not required in code currently?
Yeah, and then Mira, I saw that your hand was raised, but maybe Ian made the point that you were going to. So if you have anything, otherwise, Jamie.
Yeah, I intentionally lowered my hand.
Yeah, Jamie, go ahead. Jamie, are you able? Okay, cool.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Just kind of going back to the modeling question. I guess that's a little difficult for me to give feedback on too, just because of, like I said, the fact that I don't necessarily understand the whole modeling process, all things that go into modeling. So I guess this is kind of where it's good for us to have these avenues of communication, because hopefully we can help each other to understand some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I think we could continue to elaborate on this. I am going to go ahead and just once again drop this in the chat. If I'm able to. I don't know what happened. Well, my screen is now frozen, but if folks want to continue contributing to this document, that would be great. Don't know why I cannot move this cursor around anymore, but I wanted to just quickly go over the last 4 slides. Okay, my computer is frozen, but there are a few more questions that we would love for you all to contribute to. So thanks, Joel. So if folks, as we're kind of, I do want to open it up for public comment, because we do have 3 or 4 people here outside of the task force. And so I want to give them the opportunity to share their thoughts. But some of the remaining questions, one of them, as you can see on the screen here, Should the equity analysis for permits include an analysis of how to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts that are identified? Again, this language is coming directly from the statute. So if there is like more specificity that you as a task force member want, because, we will, this is already written in the statute, like the task force can develop a potential recommendation that an equity analysis should be conducted for permits. So like on avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating. But if there's a way that you want to elaborate and provide more detail, this is the perfect opportunity to do it. And please go ahead and edit these stickies. The next slide, should this task force come up with its own definition for cumulative impacts for Colorado? Again, the world is our oyster. I mean, as the task force members, we can really consider what do we want to, we are already considering, redefining disproportionately impacted community as it is in the statute, but do we need to do that for cumulative impacts? And then the next slide, should environmental screening tools such as EnviroScreen be used to make decisions about where the government invests its resources? And then lastly, does an equity or cumulative impacts analysis look different for urban versus rural populations? And if so, how do we account for that? So again, when I'm writing this as a question, it's like, yes, the cumulative impact would probably look different, but I need you as task force members that are writing these recommendations to tell us exactly, what that would look like. So yes, continue to welcome feedback. Thanks, Joel, for sharing your screen. I do want to open it up for public comment. So folks who are on the call and would like to share, please raise your hand and we'll call on you in the order that you raise your hand. Thanks, Velma. You can go ahead.
Hello. I didn't expect you that quick. Hang on just a second. So I have some, I've been kind of making notes as the discussion progressed. It's been a really interesting discussion, and the presentation from the folks in Chicago was excellent, and really made a number of the points that about the interface between environmental justice activities and sort of standard or more traditional regulatory activities that come up in this discussion of equity analysis, but also apply to a lot of regulatory situations. So to start with, I think I want to say Jamie and others are quite right about the need for action in the absence of site-specific data, including proceeding with equity analysis. The absence of site-specific data, I agree with them, should itself definitely be a component, a factor in an equity analysis, and in my opinion, should prompt more stringent regulation until it can be shown with publicly available and reviewed data that the community situation will not be worsened by a given activity, permit, or other operation. Too often, the absence of site-specific data is used as an excuse for inaction when, in fact, there is plenty of scientific information about the health effects of certain pollutants. There is permit-related information, however limited it might be, about the nature of the pollutants from certain facilities, and plenty of information about the other existing burdens and impacts on communities, all of which can be utilized in ways that the folks from Chicago described. in bringing non-traditional factors into decision-making into regulatory decision-making, both for equity analysis and other regulatory action. That's one way in which permit terms and permit reporting can be utilized until there is site-specific data from the community level. Waiting for that data has long since become unacceptable. As a Pueblo public health physician, I can tell you, and I hear from our other impacted communities that there's little or no data or information about conditions at the breathing spaces of the residents. Furthermore, the permit-related databases are not inaccessible, quote, because the community doesn't know what to do with them, unquote, but because they are nearly incomprehensible and difficult to use, even for those of us with technical training. It's the responsibility, in my opinion, of permitted entities and regulators to make the specific databases available and comprehensible in a useful format for the communities to make use of them in making decisions and participating in decisions about granting these industries permission to use our air and water for waste disposal. As such, equity analysis for the monitoring phase of a process should include the essential burdens in the to the communities, existing polluters in the communities, and what, if any, available monitoring does exist. Likewise, equity analysis around modeling could include those same types of factors and possibly be utilized to bring new factors into the permitting discussions and terms with the regulated community. I would make one last comment about whether analyses should have to be done for every regulatory action. And it seems to me, and this I think is something that I think maybe the agency would need could also think about, is if there's existing equity analysis for a specific community for a project, then why couldn't that analysis be cataloged and utilized as baseline information, provided that it's kept updated and that it's made specific for a given permit. It doesn't seem to me that, well, I agree that there are very few actions that I would be willing to see go forward without at least a review of the existing equity analysis. And if there isn't one, then there should be. But I don't see a necessity to have to start from scratch with every regulatory action. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Velma. Do any task force members want to respond or have anything to share? And if there are other commenters that would like to come off mute, please raise your hand. All right. Thanks again, Velma. And if there are any other commenters, feel free to use the last few minutes. Otherwise, Ian, I do want to give you the floor for a minute. I know that you had an announcement that you might want to make. So feel free to share.
Sure. I'm dropping in the chat a report that I worked on for the last year, the CU Public Health School, that documents cumulative pollution data audit of North Denver, roughly I-25 to I-270, where we documented more than 183 businesses that are impacting the air quality or water quality or have soil implications. Some of just the high level takeaways there are dozens of businesses, small businesses that have been out of compliance with either Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act or RCRA for the soil for the 12 of the last 12 quarters. There are more than 93, there are 93, I think, exactly, businesses that are in active violation currently. And it's just an overall analysis that we worked on for the last year. There's some news stories that are going to come out later this week about it. But it was really intent on building a body of data in the meantime while the I-70 settlement was being implemented with CSU as the study partner. And so, you know, there's a lot of takeaways here. There's data justice issues, missing data that are highlighted. But I just wanted to share it with you. We broke up all the different portions into different industries. So transportation related, goods and manufacturing, et cetera. You can see it all in there. The executive summary highlights it, and then the appendices to it list all of the businesses and whether or not they've been in compliance or not. And we had a community release this Saturday in Commerce City where we invited communities from North Denver to learn about it. The governor's administration did come and they have this in their hands now. And our website got delayed. It's supposed to be up, they promised me, by tomorrow, but I also have a Spanish version of this as well.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for dropping that resource in the chat. In our last few minutes here, are there any others that want to make any announcements or share out? Sure, Kelly, I saw your chat.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm Kelly Crandall at the Colorado PUC. I'm stepping in a little bit for Doug here, but I've been trying to think of how to best contribute to some of the questions that are being raised around equity analysis. And I wanted to just kind of run by a little bit of my thinking and just, it's, you know, kind of my personal thinking on how it might apply in a commission context. It's not anything that we have implemented yet, but we have to create rules under Senate Bill 272 to think about some of what's being talked about with like a centralized equity analysis. I guess I've been thinking of it as potentially like something like an EnviroScreen tool that could be used to identify disproportionately impacted communities, communities of interest. But then say you're talking about a utility rate case or something like that, that's an adjudication. I don't really know if that's something that is you all are thinking of in this context, but you know, you might look at those communities for purposes of assessing benefits and burdens. And then in the commission context, it's looking at energy burden disconnections. It's things that are not necessarily the same as the things that were used to identify communities. So is that, I guess, am I kind of going on a track in terms of what you all are thinking for how an equity analysis might apply in our context?
Yeah, I guess, you know, the question, and I think we're still thinking through this too. And I appreciate you bringing it up. I think, you know, another like related question that we're thinking about at WRA is also how to get equity into evidence, whatever that looks like, you know, particularly for regulatory proceedings that have, you know, stringent rules on what goes into evidence and what does not. So, you know, one, how can we get equity analyses considered as part of the evidentiary, like the body of evidence considered in these cases? And then also, how do we make these cases more accessible to environmental justice communities to be able to participate and to be able to share their feedback and experience as part of these proceedings. So I think those are sort of the two tracks that we're that we're thinking about right now?
I'm trying to think, we engaged in the transportation electrification plan as the first environmental justice coalition with Excel and then Black Hills. And it came up with Black Hills in particular because they're paying the highest rates in the state as it is. And we had conversations with the consumer council. I forget what their name is, but their job is to protect ratepayers. And we got into this interesting dialogue in front of the commissioners about would a slight increase in rates have an impact on them? Yes. But if you carve out larger percentages on the back end for them to get down payment assistance to make the transition to clean energy long-term, that's a benefit for them. And we did a surveying, we went into the communities. I traveled to the cities from Sugar City all the way to Westcliff, and the sum of our evidence said yes, but it was a dialogue that did play out in front of the PUC.
Yeah, thank you all. I think I've been trying to think about for an equity analysis where some of the decisions we make could have a public health impact and some couldn't. And so where does the equity analysis fit into our process? So thank you all for some thoughts on that.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your time. We're just a minute past the hour, and we have spent 3 hours together. So I do want folks to get to your kiddos and to dinner and whatever you have ahead of you in the evening. I will reiterate one last time, if you could please contribute to the draft recommendations by using the Jamboard or the PowerPoint that we were just reviewing. We welcome kind of your further elaborations on those last 4 questions that we weren't able to get to. We will send out a date for our next equity analysis subcommittee meeting, just considering just all the different stuff that we have going on. We likely will not have a meeting in June, TBD on that, but our next meeting will likely take place in July. If you have any continued feedback on any recommendations, please do continue to share them with us. All right, well, with that said, thanks again. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you all soon.